In the previous material, we finished by talking about the figure of the true leader of the supposedly independent Azerbaijan. From June to November 1918, Turkish General Nuri Pasha and his attitude towards the Azerbaijani army, which was just as real as the aforementioned independence. In fact, at that time, one could only speak of the latter with a very, very large stretch of the imagination. Indeed, what kind of independence could there be if from 17th June? In the so-called Azerbaijan Democratic Republic, there wasn't even a military minister of its own, nor, by the way, a separate legislative body. The National Council, which had so joyfully proclaimed independence on the 28th of May, was already dissolved on the 17th of June at the insistence of the Ottoman commander-in-chief, and both executive and legislative power formally became concentrated in the hands of the so-called government, headed by Fatali Khan Khoysky. At the same time, almost imperceptibly and in a rather matter-of-fact way, even the nominal possibility of controlling their own armed forces disappeared from the political scene of the newly established statehood. That is, in case they had any armed forces in any significant number at all. In general, the founding theorists of such Turkish-style democracy were probably turning in their graves with tremendous force. Indeed, for at least the past few centuries, the aforementioned form of government has always been required to include the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers. And after less than 3 weeks of the ADR's existence, even before their triumphant entry into the capital of the newly proclaimed state, Baku, it had already de jure lost its separate legislative branch. Her elder Turkish brothers strongly recommended consolidating it by merging it with the executive branch. At the same time, to be perfectly honest, they also effectively gutted the latter almost entirely, stripping it of its main power function, the military. Although, as a concession, the police component, the post of head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, was graciously allowed by Nuri Pasha for the Azerbaijani politicians to retain. In this regard, it is worth recalling that even in the most difficult years, both during the Civil War and the Great Patriotic War, the structures of Soviet power ensured the clear separation of the legislative, executive, and judicial systems. The Central Executive Committee, later the Supreme Soviet, the Council of People's Commissars, and the Supreme Court. Even at the stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which seemingly had no need for such apparent excesses, but in reality this was a crucial mechanism for preventing possible abuses in the governance of society and the country. Someone might ask, what about the judiciary in the ADR? Was it forgotten, or should we clarify this? Well, Nuri Pasha decided to openly take it into his own hands, even nominally. In any case, when it came to the most important, the absolutely crucial matters of life and death for the citizens of this supposedly now independent state, which he, together with his subordinate askars, was supposedly liberating from foreign oppression. Resolution of the Council of Ministers on declaring the territory of Azerbaijan under martial law. 19th June 1918. All of Azerbaijan, due to extraordinary circumstances, to declare martial law and instruct the Minister of Internal Affairs, in agreement with the commander of the Caucasian Islamic army, to develop the corresponding mandatory resolution. Chairman of the Council of Ministers, Fatali Khan Khoysky. Resolution of the Council of Ministers on the introduction of martial law regulations. 23rd June 1918. Well, yes, the laws are introduced by an entire government resolution. That's just an oxymoron. Of sorts. In view of the imposition of martial law throughout the territory of Azerbaijan, according to the government resolution, the following mandatory decree is announced. The following criminal offences are removed from general jurisdiction, and will be tried under the procedures of martial law for those found guilty. Murder, banditry, robbery, armed resistance to the authorities. Abductions and rapes of women, arson of residential buildings and barns, damage to railways, telegraph and telephone lines and installations. Persons found guilty of these crimes will be immediately brought before the Military Investigative Commission, which, after investigating the case, will refer it to the military court. The verdict of the latter is confirmed by the commander of the Caucasian Islamic army. That is, by the same Nuri Pasha. And it is carried out within 24 hours after the ruling. However, even cases not subject to execution by shooting, where the supreme judge and highest appellate authority, appointed by the government of independent Azerbaijan as the Turkish Serasker, are involved, somehow do not quite align with the essence of basic democratic norms. Let us continue quoting the government's documents. Further from EDR. Second, the following acts are considered prohibited and are subject to administrative punishment. A. It is forbidden to announce or publicly spread false rumours and information that could incite national or inter-class enmity. And of course, only the democratic politicians, together with the Turkish interventionists, had the right to determine whether these rumours and pieces of information were false. Naturally, with the possibility of prosecuting even the most basic expression of national, communist, or even social democratic ideas under this article. After all, they could supposedly incite class enmity. Honestly, I have no words. This is true freedom of speech, apparently. B. It is forbidden to disseminate information about the actions and orders of the government and the operations of military units. But this is already bordering on the absurd, to forbid people from talking about government orders, while at the same time demanding that they be obeyed. What? Apparently, it's in the spirit of that old Christian saying, "Go I know not where, bring I know not what." V. All kinds of rallies and large gatherings are prohibited without special permission from the relevant authorities. Well, of course, no more than 2 people together, or else you'll end up in the slammer for an unsanctioned rally. That's democracy in action too. G. All individuals and persons who, in accordance with all current legal regulations and statutes, do not currently possess the valid certificates granting the legal right to carry lethal firearms and the corresponding ammunition for them, are strictly required, within a period of 2 weeks from the specific date of this official announcement, to voluntarily surrender and hand over these items to the authorities. Any weapons in their possession to the nearest military unit or to the chief of police, against a receipt. E. After the period specified in the previous article has expired, the homes of all citizens suspected of possessing weapons, regardless of their social status, will be searched by military units. Any weapons found will be confiscated, and those responsible will be subjected to the highest penalty provided for by these regulations. Z. Persons found guilty of violating the rules specified in Section 2 of this decree will be subject to administrative penalties. A fine of up to 10,000 rubles, or imprisonment for up to 6 months, or expulsion from Azerbaijan. The imposition of these penalties is fully vested in the Minister of Internal Affairs, and within the limits of a fine up to 5,000 rubles and imprisonment for up to 3 months in the governor. And for district chiefs, within the limits of a fine up to 1,000 rubles and imprisonment for up to 1 month. 3. This mandatory decree comes into force from the day of its publication and remains in effect until the declared state of martial law is lifted. Minister of Internal Affairs B.A. Jumanshir. In the excerpt above, particular interest is drawn to the points regarding the prohibition on possessing weapons and the sanctions for failing to comply. Even if we assume that by the highest measure of punishment for violators, the document still means something unusual. For us, the concept of the highest measure as the death penalty is unfamiliar. It refers only to large fines, exile, imprisonment, and other less severe punishments, yet some confusion still inevitably arises. After all, in the Russian Empire, at least closer to the revolution, firearms legislation was actually very liberal. It is enough to say that the murder of Stolypin, the socialist revolutionary, SR, Agrov calmly bought the Browning he used for the attack, in a gun shop, practically without any obstacles. As for firearms, there's nothing to talk about. They were expensive, yes, but just as during the terrifying Stalinist tyranny, they were sold even in hardware stores to anyone who wanted them. And as for the Caucasus, where an important element of the Highlanders' national dress even today is the gaza, cloth cases worn on the chest for storing, cartridges to allow for the fastest possible reloading of weapons, the popularity of personal firearms there. Goes without saying. All the more so because this popularity was also dictated by sheer necessity in those regions. And against this backdrop, seemingly law-abiding citizens, after all the presumption of innocence hasn't been abolished, are being completely disarmed by their so-called protectors and liberators under the crescent flag. Although, to be fair, they are offered an alternative, to join an official armed formation. But here's the problem. Again, well, there are very few such opportunities. Opportunities that could truly be called national Azerbaijani ones, since the ADR government didn't even have its own Ministry of Defense for that matter. Meanwhile, the real commander of all the security forces, wearing Turkish military uniforms, was busy rebranding his troops, renaming them the Caucasian Islamic Army. He was making a concerted effort to recruit as many locals as possible, all in order to fight for the interests of the Ottoman Empire. But in truth, it wasn't going very well. According to many contemporaries, among the Muslim population of the Elisavetpol and Baku provinces, there was no desire whatsoever to fight or to join the Turkish troops in capturing Baku. Russian officers reported to the volunteer army that in 2 weeks Turkish officers had managed to gather only 300 men. The population was fleeing mobilization into the mountains, into the forests, even to the Armenians. There were difficulties in mobilizing the Caucasian Turks and a complete lack of motivation among them. To fight for Baku, Turkish sources mention the repressions by the Ottoman army against those unwilling to join the Army of Islam. According to Turkish sources, around 600 young Muslims were hanged by the Turkish command for refusing to join the Turkish forces and for desertion. Isn't this one of the key reasons for the Caucasian Islamic Army's slow advance towards Baku, eh? After all, the distance from the area occupied by the Turks, back on the 25th of May, it was less than 300 kilometers in a straight line from Ganja. By the better roads, it was about 50 kilometers further. And yet this rather pitiful distance, Nuri Pasha's army took nearly 4 months to cover it, until the 15th of September. That is, their average speed of advance was less than 3 kilometers per day. As if the Turks were crawling the whole way. Seriously though, of course, the advancing Turkish units moved in the usual way for those times, on foot, switching to a run when attacking if necessary. And such slow progress was precisely due to the excessively sluggish pace of mobilizing the local population. Well, the human resources of the Ottoman Empire were not infinite. You have to understand, they couldn't just burn through them endlessly on the new Azerbaijani front. So Nuri Pasha wasn't in any hurry, taking every opportunity to replenish his stocks of cannon fodder, who, unsurprisingly, weren't particularly keen on dying. For the interests and ambitions of their own politicians, let alone their strategic partners and true masters. Although, of course, the resistance put up by the Baku Soviet army shouldn't be discounted either. As it happens, the army's combat effectiveness is still judged by the memoirs of the British General Dunsterville, thankfully not Baskerville, who arrived in early August 1918 to help the Baku defenders repel the Turkish attacks. And who then promptly sailed back to Iran on ships, just on the eve of Baku's surrender. He especially likes to quote their episode where the dignified Briton was deeply shocked when, inspecting the defensive line, he found that at one of the firing positions, there was neither a gun nor a machine gun. As it turned out, the soldier stationed there had gone home for lunch, taking his heavy weapon with him. He took it with him, hitched to a cart, so that no one would steal it. But if you think about it, what is there really to be outraged about? Except, perhaps, at the carelessness of the commanding officers, who allowed one of the most powerful anti-enemy weapons to be manned by just a single person. Especially considering that in the Red Army, even a Degtярov light machine gun required at least 2 men to operate. The second man would carry 3 heavy magazines, each weighing 4.5 kilograms, loaded with cartridges. The crew for a tank-mounted Maxim machine gun consisted of nearly a dozen Red Army soldiers. As for artillery, that's a whole different story. But here, they left a single solitary soldier at his post, playing the role of a one-man band, and on top of that, they didn't even supply him with rations. So, in fact, such hapless commanders ought to have been glad that this soldier, heading off for lunch to maintain his combat effectiveness, didn't leave his weapon unattended, but thoughtfully took it with him, and returned to his post with it after having the meal every serviceman is entitled to. Returning to General Dunsterville, it seems that such an impression of the appalling state of the Baku Soviet army was deliberately created by him. He did this intentionally to justify his own failure in the eyes of his command. After all, despite the task set before him, a strategically important city and vast oil reserves, he ingloriously surrendered them to the Turks. Another matter is that with the British detachment numbering just over 1,000 soldiers, it was rather difficult to stand alone against more than 1.5. Tens of thousands of advancing askers. It really was quite a challenge. And after 1st of August of this year, The Menshevik-Dashnak majority in the council dismissed the Council of People's Commissars, led by Shaumian in the Baku commune, who were later arrested and went down in history as the executed 26 Baku commissars. The combat effectiveness of the local detachments, left without the Bolsheviks, really did drop sharply. One way or another, on the 15th of September 1918, Baku was taken. According to the Turks, their local puppets, and the modern-day followers of these puppets, it was liberated. Although, if by liberation one means the preceding mass exodus from the city of the Armenian and Russian population before its capture, and the equally large-scale massacre that soon followed, those who didn't manage to leave or didn't want to, ta-da! The once multicultural city was indeed liberated. Although, in modern terminology, this is more often referred to as ethnic cleansing. The ADR government, still lacking even its own Minister of Defense, this time entered the official capital, even quicker than it had entered Ganja in June. All this happened just 2 days later, on the 17th of September. But alas, it didn't get to enjoy its new status for long. On the fronts of the imperialist war, the collapse of the troops was accelerating rapidly. The coalition of the Central Powers ultimately ended up acknowledging their defeat and withdrawing from the war. For the Ottoman Empire, this happened on 30th October 1918 with the signing of the Mudros Armistice. In effect, this was a capitulation, albeit not an unconditional one, but it threatened the losing side with actual partition and eventual disappearance in the not-too-distant future. Naturally, the ripples soon reached the South Caucasus as well. Turkish troops were withdrawn from Azerbaijan, and the local personnel of the Caucasian Islamic army were sent home. In a sense, one could say that the dream of true Azerbaijani patriots had finally come true. A real statehood, genuinely independent of anyone. Statehood. But as is often the case, reality turned out to be far less joyful than those idyllic dreams. The regime in newly conquered Baku faced rather bleak prospects. After all, no matter how much its leaders proclaimed their own independence and autonomy, to the surrounding countries they appeared to be nothing more than a collaborationist appendage to the Turkish army, which had occupied vast areas of the South Caucasus, territories that, after the defeat of the Entente's opponents, including the Ottoman Empire, were now supposed to become a zone of British interest. Perhaps it is best at this point to give the floor to the Azerbaijani author Tahir Bekbudov, Associate Professor at the Department of Social Sciences, Police Academy, Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Republic of Azerbaijan. Candidate of Historical Sciences of the Azerbaijan Republic, Honored Teacher of the Republic of Azerbaijan from the newspaper Zekalo. Given his position, it is reasonable to assume that the views he expressed, if not strictly identical to those of official Baku, are at least very close to them. And it was only the particular political intuition of the leaders of the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic that allowed them to quickly reorient their policy and move towards rapprochement with the Allied command stationed in Iran. Taking such a decision would have given Azerbaijan a chance to avoid being classified as an ally of Ottoman Turkey. In matters concerning the capitulation of the countries of the Triple Alliance, therefore, the leaders of the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic, first and foremost, began to look for ways to resolve relations with the British military command stationed in northern Iran, whose army was already prepared to invade Azerbaijan. Based on this, it was necessary to immediately start negotiations. One of the pretexts for accelerating the start of the negotiation process was a meeting between Muslims from the Lankaran district and the British Council. On the 14th of November 1918 in Baku, they appealed with a request to restore public order and law in their district. The consul promised to report this to the commander of the British Army in the city of Enzeli, where he was going to negotiate with the delegation of the ADR government, consisting of A. Agayeva, Rafievula N. Usbekova. On instructions from the government, members of the Azerbaijani delegation made a statement to the British command, in particular to General Thompson, that they did not object to the entry of a detachment of Allied troops on November 17th to the city of Baku under the command of Your Excellency. In addition, they reported that the ADR government was taking all necessary measures to receive and accommodate the incoming detachment, to which General Thompson replied, "I thank you, and I'm quite certain that by cooperating in the manner you have indicated, our mutual relations will remain entirely satisfactory." In the address that was announced on the morning of 17th November, it was stated that as a result of negotiations between the Azerbaijani government and the representative of the Allied forces, in NZLI, General Thompson, an agreement was reached, according to which today, 17th November in the morning, a detachment of Allied forces led by General Thompson would enter the capital of Azerbaijan. This entry of the Allied detachment is not a hostile act that could threaten the independence and territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. All state and public institutions will continue to function as normal, just as before. The government has taken all necessary measures to maintain order in the city. The government calls on all citizens to remain calm and orderly, and to give the Allied detachment a friendly welcome. Well, in some ways, one can indeed agree with the author of the quoted lies. The political instinct of the ADR figures was truly quite remarkable. In any case, when it came to the necessity of what is often referred to by a not particularly respectful term, changing sides mid-flight. That is, a sharp shift in foreign policy priorities and allies, which, to call things by their proper names, amounts to betraying former allies and ideals. And as for the zeal with which the aforementioned figures trying to present the situation with the already decided introduction of British troops into the Transcaucasus by the Entente Council, including into Azerbaijan as a whole. In particular, it rather strongly brings to mind the ending of a slightly risque joke. Relax and enjoy it as much as you can. However, in that joke, no one was expecting or inviting the attacking side, unlike the episode described below. A ceremonial rally was held in the station square, where a huge number of citizens had gathered, at which the acting Minister of Foreign Affairs, Adil Khan Ziadkhanov, addressed the general with the following greeting. The government has authorized me to welcome, in your excellency's person, the representatives of the great European powers who have arrived in the capital of Azerbaijan. Now, for humanity, which has shed so much blood, a new era of peaceful social endeavour is opening, founded on universal solidarity. The young Azerbaijani nation, which has endured so many upheavals in its statehood, has only just embarked on the path of independence. Our people are filled with a firm and unwavering hope that their elder brothers, the peoples of Europe, with their centuries-old civilization, will not refuse, in the name of the lofty and sacred ideals of humanity, to accept it into their family. The aspiration to join the united European family. We've heard this somewhere before. Over 100 years ago, the Azerbaijani bourgeois elite decided that their elder Turkish brothers were no longer suitable for them, since they had lost the war, and so they wanted new brothers, European ones. Although they didn't bother to ask first whether the Europeans themselves actually wanted this. The Entente! And does the proletarian population of Azerbaijan or its peasantry actually want this? Well, that's just a minor detail in it. As for how this new brotherhood, that is the fraternalization of Azerbaijani politicians with the victors over their former Turkish brothers ended, we'll cover that in the next part of our series.